Today on Know the Truth, Philip de Courcy teaches us how to guard the truth.
Don't get drawn away, sidetracked by contentions, strivings about the law, genealogies, and moronic theological disputes. And stay away from the mousetraps of the false teachers and their speculations and their strife. Keep the main thing, the gospel, the plain thing.
Welcome to Know the Truth with Philip de Courcy. I'm your host, Wayne Shepherd. Have you ever been in a family or a workplace where one person created so much turmoil that it threatened the peace and safety of everyone? Well, the same problem can arise in the church if leaders sit back and do nothing. You may even seen these issues play out in your own church. Today we'll hear clear instruction for dealing with these divisive people. You can also listen online at ktt.org and find additional resources. Here's Philip.
Titus chapter 3, verses 9 through 11, where Titus is told by Paul that it is the role of a pastor, it is the job of a leader sometimes to reject people. Did you notice that? Verse 10? Reject. Have nothing to do with, is the Greek, have nothing to do with a divisive man. After the first and second admonition, knowing that such a person is warped and sinning and being self-condemned. Now, if you're wanting an outline, here's how I've broken verses 9 through 11 up. 1, there is a pivotal contrast. 2, there's a personal concern. And 3, there's a pastoral caution. Let's look at a pivotal contrast. And here's the contrast. At the end of verse 8, you'll notice these words, these things. There are certain things that are good and profitable. But, notice verse 9, there are certain things that are unprofitable and useless. This is the contrast. This isn't a new paragraph. In fact, this is the conclusion of an argument that started in verse 1. Remind them. And in verses 1 through 8, Titus is to remind the Christians on Crete of gospel indicatives and gospel imperatives. He's to remind them that they were once lost, but God in His mercy saved them, and the gospel is explained in verses 3 through 7. But gospel indicatives lead to gospel imperatives. When a man understands the gospel and believes the gospel and God saves him, his life changes, and good works follow his faith in Jesus Christ. These things, these gospel indicatives and these gospel imperatives, these things affirm constantly to those who believe that they need to be careful in doing good works, and that's profitable to men. But in contrast, within the church, people can be disruptive. False teachers can strive about the law. In fact, here we're told to avoid foolish disputes, genealogies, contentions, and strivings about the law. Why? Because it's unprofitable. That's distracting. That takes you away from the gospel. Let's move on. A pivotal contrast. Secondly, a practical concern. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, a practical concern. And the concern is that a good choice be made. Because if a bad choice is made and you get drawn into foolish disputes and genealogies and contentions and strivings about the law, nothing profitable results. Nothing useful comes of that. See, that's his practical concern. He's already introduced the issue of false teachers and false teaching in chapter 1, verses 10 through 16. They pose a threat to the health, holiness, and harmony of the church. And he seems to be returning to that issue right here. And he's concerned that the church that has the gospel and ought to be living that gospel for the good of all men, that they could fritter away that power and significance through feuding, that they'd get off track, that they wouldn't keep the main things the plain things and the plain things the main things. No, they get drawn into fanciful theological debate. They get involved in speculation and strife, and that's bad news for the church, and that's bad news for the community. Bad news for the church's vitality, focus, unity, and witness before the world. And that's why this kind of stuff that's profitless and useless is to be avoided. Notice that? But avoid. In verse 8, you'll notice there are things I want you to affirm and stress. The gospel and living it out as a witness before the community. That's good. Do that. And what you mustn't do, this is my concern, don't do this. Avoid foolish disputes, genealogies, contentions, and strivings about the law. The word avoid there in the Greek simply means to go around. There's some places you go around because you want to avoid that place. And there are some people at work or in your neighborhood you go around, you know? You see them coming and all of a sudden you've got a great interest in the soda machine at work, or you duck into the bathroom because you want to avoid them. That's just the way life is. And Paul is saying, hey, there are certain issues and certain individuals avoid. Give them a wide berth. Stay clear. What are they? Well, in the life of the church, number one, foolish disputes. It's interesting, strong word, foolish, kind of understated here. Foolish means stupid. Or it's actually the Greek word from which we get our English word moron. We tend not to use that word anymore, moron. You're a moron. It's a great word, actually, but in a politically correct culture, we probably shouldn't say it that much. But here's what the Bible's saying. Stay away from moronic disputes. Don't become a moron where you allow another moron to draw you into moronic disputes. Because that's a waste of time, gets you away from the gospel, grieves the Spirit, and gets you off the mark in terms of trying to reach people with the gospel. All right? Now, what might that be? Theological tangents. Discussions on doctrines that serve no purpose. Getting involved in subjective rather than objective discussion, but getting involved in conjecture rather than substance. Stay away from that. You know what? There's enough of the Bible that's easily understood that will take me a lifetime to master than get drawn off in tangents. Now, let me say this by way of qualification, as verses 10 through 16 of chapter 1 make clear. Paul is not prohibiting all theological controversy or all disputes. He writes several letters that are all about disputes. Colossians is about early Gnosticism and a denial of the incarnation, and Paul writes about it in a controversial, polemical manner. He writes to the Galatians, he doesn't even say hello to them, he just gets stuck in. I'm so fed up hearing about the fact that you're removed from the gospel. And then he chastises them and warns them about the Judaizers. Hebrews is written to scold and rebuke Christians that are thinking, going back to Judaism and the Old Covenant. So there's much of the New Testament that's polemical. So don't read into this text, you can't get involved in disputes, doctrinal or controversies theological. What is being prohibited here? Moronic disputes, tangential disputes, secondary matter disputes. In fact, I came across true story about a church in Tennessee. There was a time in the life of Baptists in Tennessee where foot washing was in vogue. Jesus talks about foot washing. Is that an ordinance or not? There were some Christians that believed that was an ordinance, like baptism and the Lord's table. And this church did that. As part of their worship, they watched each other's feet. But it comes to a point in which there's a dispute. Do you start with the left one or the right one? It's true, Bill. And here we have this stupid dispute. And there was a split. And you have the left foot Baptists. Tragic. And we laugh. But let's be honest, sometimes when we get drawn into blogging and media platforms and discussing things, before long, man, we're all involved in moronic disputes that really get us off our game, that aren't profitable or useful for the life of the church. Number two, genealogies. Genealogies, that's an emphasis you can imagine on birth, pedigree, ethnicity, something very important to Jews. And let's be honest, there's a reality there because, you know what, there were things promised to the seed of Abraham, literally. There were blessings involved in tying yourself into the covenant made with Abraham and his descendants. You get into Joshua, and a Jew's territory was determined by a Jew's tribe. So I get it, genealogies are important. But as time went by, they took on a life of their own. And by the time of Jesus' time, the focus was on not who a man was in terms of his character, but whom a man was, what family he belonged to. Was he of the seed of Abraham? And yet he didn't live like Abraham, but his connection to Abraham biologically covered all his sins. And Jesus challenged that. In fact, the gospel challenges that. Paul in Philippians 3 says what? I was of the stock of Israel, Hebrew of Hebrews. I'm of the tribe of Benjamin. But while many believe that's important, I've come to realize faith in Jesus Christ is more important. And setting those things aside, I'm pursuing him. And it seems that given the fact that some of the false teachers, according to chapter 1, verse 10, were of the circumcision from a Jewish background, they were making issues over genealogy. And they were doing a kind of a one-upmanship, probably on Gentile believers. Well, you know what? You want to hear about my genealogy? I tie into Moses. I tie into Abraham. I tie into Jacob. Paul says, stay away from that stuff. Contentions? That's self-explanatory. Stay away from fights. Stay away from feuding over secondary issues, preferences, rivalries. That was going on in Corinth, right? I'm of Paul. I'm of Apollos. Stay away from people who can pick a fight with their own shadow. I mean, there are people like that. I used to belong to a denomination of Baptists who were pretty well known for their feuding and their fighting. And we used to tell jokes on ourselves. And the joke was this, that a pastor was once, shipwrecked and stranded on an island. And he stayed there for several years until he was rescued. And as he was being winched up on the helicopter, they looked to the brow of the hill. And there were 3 buildings. And they said, are you sure you're the only one on the island? He said, yes, the building on the left. He says, that's my home. He says, the building in the middle, that's the church I go to. And the building on the right, that's the church I used to go to. You get that? There's only one guy. Oh, okay. But there's people like that. They'll fight with their own shadow. Leave them on an island to themselves and there'll be disputes. Paul says, stay away from people like that. Contentious people who want to fight over everything and fight over nothing. Then there's strivings about the law. Again, we're back to this idea of chapter 1, verse 10. Many insubordinate, idle talkers, deceivers, especially those of the circumcision, the Jewish party. Given the fact that circumcision is mentioned in chapter 1 and the fact strivings over the law are mentioned in chapter 3, we would connect those dots and say, hey, there was probably some within the churches in Crete arguing for this fact that, you know what, you need to be circumcised. It's the Judaizers that we read about in Acts 15 and in the book of Galatians. They argued, you know what? If you want to be a complete Christian, you need to not only follow Jesus, but Moses. You need not only grace, but the law. Now, all Christians believe that the moral law was good. Paul says that in his letter to Timothy, the moral law is good. Keeping the law of God, the 10 Commandments, reflects God's character, his holiness, is good for society, and certainly a path to righteousness. But Christians were not bound to the ceremonial law. But there were some that wanted to bind Christians to the ceremonial law, circumcision, dietary laws. That's why in his letter to Timothy, Paul will address that. Talks about how all food is good and stuff like that. And it seems that there were those who wanted to add Moses to Jesus, the law to grace, and works to faith. It was another gospel. And Paul says, hey, avoid that kind of person. Now, listen, I want to move on to the last thought, but I want to kind of summarize this. These 4 things are to be avoided like the plague, right? Strong word, avoid. Go around. Don't get drawn into. Don't be party to. Why? Because they're profitless. They're useless. None of that produces verse 8. That's the point. None of that produces verse 8, which is affirming the trustworthy statements about the gospel in verses 3 to 7 and living out your belief in the gospel through good works, which makes an impact on men who who are without Christ. So the point is, the church needs to keep its focus on its priorities and make the gospel its passion. Verse 8, affirm the gospel constantly. Verse 8, practice the gospel radically. Verse 8, share the gospel widely to all men. And verse 9, focus on the gospel jealously. Don't get drawn away, sidetracked by contentions, strivings about the law, genealogies, and moronic theological disputes. It's simply this: guard against mission drift. May we at Kindred constantly guard ourselves. Every decision we make, every discussion we get into, when you and I are together, let's keep bringing ourselves back to, how does this advance the gospel? How does this make our witness before men more effective? My father introduced me to a character that Charles Spurgeon had created. The character was called John Plowman. In fact, you can buy a little book by Spurgeon called John Plowman's Talks. In fact, it's been reprinted. I recommend it highly to you. It's called Spurgeon's Practical Wisdom by Banner of Truth. Now, John Plowman didn't exist. He was a literary creation of Spurgeon's imaginative mind. And John Plowman was just your ordinary Englishman, farmer by trade, laborer by occupation. And he would pass on these wise statements, and Spurgeon wrote them down. Here's one of them. Here's one of the maxims of John Plowman. Here's what he said: never stop a plow to catch a mouse. I know I'm talking a lot of city slickers, so try and imagine you're in a field and a farmer, and here's what John Plowman says: think of a man and a boy and 4 horses all standing still for the sake of a mouse. You know, they're plowing, big horses, the big field, the crop's got to be sown, the harvest is coming. All of a sudden they stop because they see a tiny little mouse. And they go mouse hunting, and the seed never gets sown, and the crop never gets planted, and the harvest never comes. That's a little piece of wisdom in life. Basically, keep the main thing the plain thing. You can say it in a whole lot of different words. Now, John Plowman ends up sharing this with his minister, again, fictional. And the minister says, you know what? I can identify with that because in the church, there's a lot of mouse hunting that goes on. Now, listen to these words from the minister talking to John Plowman. A society of good Christian people will split into pieces over a petty quarrel or a mere matter of opinion, while all around them, masses of people are perishing. A miserable little mouse, which no cat would ever hunt, takes them off from the Lord's work. Again, intelligent men will spend months of time and heaps of money inventing and publishing mere speculations while the great field of the world lies unplowed. They seem to care nothing how many may perish so long as they get to ride their hobby horse. In other matters, a little common sense is allowed to rule, but in the weightiest matters, foolishness is sadly conspicuous. As for you and me, John, let us kill a mouse when it nibbles on our bread, but let us not spend our lives over it. What can be done by a mousetrap or a cat should never occupy our best thoughts. You get the point. It's Paul's point. Stress these things. Stress the gospel. Stress evangelism. Stress living a life of radical discipleship for Jesus Christ in your community. And stay away from the mousetraps of the false teachers and their speculations and their strife. Keep the main thing, the gospel, the plain thing. Okay, let's move on. Last thought. There's not only a pivotal contrast between what's profitable and unprofitable. There's not only a practical concern that they stay away from that which distracts and dilutes their gospel mission, but there's a pastoral caution. And in verse 9, they're told to avoid certain issues and certain individuals. But it's interesting, by verse 10, it seems that certain issues and certain individuals become unavoidable. And here's what we read. Reject a divisive man after the first and second admonition, knowing that such a person is warped and sinning, being self-condemned. Now, who is this divisive man or divisive woman? We're not told, but one would assume that the divisive man is someone who manifests the behavior of verse 9. So the divisive man is someone in the church who is given the foolish disputes, genealogies, contentions, strivings about the law that are unprofitable. And they do it to a degree, that's the issue, they do it to a degree that becomes disruptive to the gospel. And they're confronted. And a kind pastor or a Christian leader goes and says, hey, cut it out. You know what? This isn't profitable. You've got to submit to the elders. Here's our doctrinal statement. This is what we believe. You can't teach anything else. You get the picture. And there seems to be a scenario where that happens lovingly, firmly, patiently for a while. And they don't respond. And at that point, out of love for God, out of love for the church, out of love for the witness of the church in the community, and out of love for the person being addressed, they're actually rejected. They're kicked out of the church. They are disciplined by the church. They are removed from membership, and their connection to the church is limited. That's what's being taught here. That's what we have here, the doctrine of church discipline. You'll find it in other places. Jesus taught about it, didn't he? In Matthew 18, 15 to 17. It's the mark of a healthy, effective biblical church. You read about church discipline in the letter to the Romans, chapter 16, verse 17, in the letter to the Corinthians, chapter 5, verses 1 through 11, in the first letter, in the second letter to the Thessalonians, chapter 3, verse 14. Several people are identified, and the church is told to avoid them, reject them, have nothing to do with them, turn them over to Satan, put them out of the church, treat them like publicans. Strong meat, strong stuff. Now, no church glories in this, but it's there, and it's a mark of a healthy church. Because a church is meant to be holy, pure, and unspotted from the world. And therefore, in its pursuit of holiness and purity, it will guard itself against moral lapses that become public and pronounced. It will guard itself against theological dilution of the gospel. And any pastor worth his salt and any leadership team worth their salt will do the tough side of ministry, which is this. Guys, watch out for the guy who will turn up and in 5 weeks destroy what God has been doing for 5 years. Listen to Al Mohler. Authentic biblical discipline is not an elective, but a necessary and integral mark of an authentic church.
You're listening to Philip de Courcy on Know the Truth, and today's message explains the need for church discipline. In the next few days, we'll be concluding our series in the book of Titus, but if you missed any of the messages in this study, you'll find them online at ktt.org. Now, maybe you're asking yourself, if I'm saved by grace and not by works, does it really matter how I live here and now? Well, Charles Spurgeon's timeless wisdom can help you go deeper in God's Word with our special 2-volume set, Spurgeon and the Psalms and Spurgeon and the Gospels. Walk through Scripture with the Prince of Preachers as he opens up the treasures of God's Word from the Psalms and the life of Christ in the Gospels. These elegant NKJV editions will enrich your daily devotions and help you live with eternal purpose. And as we near the end of 2025, a copy of this Spurgeon collection comes with our thanks when you support Know the Truth with a year-end gift. And right now, until December 31st, your gift will be doubled by a generous donor. So take advantage and call in your donation today. Call 888-644-8811 or give online at ktt.org. We also want to invite you to join us online this Sunday for a Kindred Christmas. Experience powerful music by special guest Steve Green as we celebrate the birth of Christ. To learn more, visit kindredchurch.org. I'm your host, Wayne Shepherd. Come back tomorrow when Philip de Courcy gives us more biblical guidance for avoiding foolish arguments and divisive people. It's coming up Thursday on Know the Truth. Today's program was produced and sponsored by Know the Truth Incorporated. Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free."